Today we get to start the third chapter of Pirkei Avos, which is a pat yourself on the back moment. We've completed 2 chapters of Pirkei Avos. That almost makes you like some kind of an expert, right? There are 6 chapters in total, so that means that if we're on chapter 3, that means we've gotten almost halfway through. I just want to mention before we get started, I would like to point out that up until this point in time, there's been a very clear chronology in the way that the chapters were laid out. So the first chapter was very much about the chronology time-wise. This set of rabbis came before that set of rabbis. The second chapter was not necessarily as chronologically time-wise, because we did see that there was a little bit of a jumping back and forth. But generally speaking, it was definitely, there was like a sense of priority of which rabbis came first in terms of their position in the community. Once we're at chapter 3, you're going to see that there is no direct chronology in this chapter, and so sometimes we go back and forth between sages who belong to earlier generations, like the first Mishnah that we're going to learn today. So the sage we're going to meet in today's Mishnah, his name is Akavya ben Mahalalel. And Akavya ben Mahalalel actually was a contemporary of Shemaiah and Avtalion. So if you go back to the first chapter, you'll remember that the very famous Hillel and Shammai, their mentors were Shemaiah and Avtalion. So from a chronological perspective, the previous chapter already spoke about Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who's all the way at the end of the period of Tanoim, of the authors of the Mishnah. And Shemaiah and Avtalion are very close to the beginning of that same period of history. So if the man in this Mishnah that we're going to learn today, Akavya ben Mahalalel, belongs to the same generation as Shemaiah and Avtalion, straight away you can tell that we are no longer concerned with chronology. So who was he? Who was Akavya ben Mahalalel? Well, the first thing you should notice about him is that he's not called rabbi, right? We mentioned this long ago when we learned about Hillel and Shammai, that the hierarchy of Talmudic scholars works as follows. If somebody carries the title Rav means that they're a person of tremendous authority. We take their views very seriously. And Rav means that they're from the later Talmudic period, the Gemara period. And they typically lived outside of Israel, which means that they typically did not have the original form of smicha, which was an ordination given through that unbroken chain all the way from Moshe Rabbeinu. If somebody was of a higher caliber, then they would be called Rabbi, like Rabbi Akiva. So that means that somebody, firstly, was a scholar from Israel, was from an earlier part of history, and had received that ordination to be able to carry the title Rabbi. Higher than that was Rabbon. Rabbon implies somebody who's like the head of the entire community of rabbis, like Rabbon Gamliel. Higher than that were the people who had no title at all, like Hillel and Shammai. We don't call them Rabbi Hillel or Rabbi Shammai, because at that particular point in history, a person with no title was considered the ultimate level of spirituality. Akavya ben Mahalalel, who we're going to learn about in today's Mishnah, he's not called Rabbi Akavya, he's called Akavya ben Mahalalel. And he was a tremendous scholar. In fact, he was such a great scholar that there was a period of time where he took a different view on a certain range of legal issues, different view from every other rabbi at the time. And although they were the majority opinion, he would not back down on his opinion because he knew he was right. And then an interesting thing happened years and years later. When he was on his deathbed, he told his son, "You have to conform to the rabbis, because I had a direct tradition from Shemaiah and Avtalion. So I was able to make a statement and stick by my opinion because I had it on really good authority. You," he's talking to his son, "you did not have that direct connection to the previous generation, so you have no choice but to conform to the majority view, and so therefore you have to take the halachic opinion of the other rabbis." So Akavya ben Mahalalel is a giant of a person, which is quite ironic because not unlike Rabbi Akiva, here you've got 2 people who are very similar in the sense that they have this huge position in the Jewish community. They're elevated to a very high level, and both of them have names that are from the root word akev, which is a heel. So So that's ironic, because the heel is the lowest part of the human body. So why would you have somebody who's at the highest level of spirituality named for the lowest part of the human body? It's a fascinating thought. So the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, who's this revolutionary Kabbalist and also the person responsible for giving us the most spiritual insight into soul journeys and reincarnation and so forth. So the Arizal teaches a very interesting principle. We have touched on this previously. And the principle is that every single soul that exists can track back to the original mega soul of Adam Harishon, of Adam himself. So every single one of us, go back far enough in our soul's journey, and you will find that we are linked in to Adam Harishon, to Adam's soul. Then the Arizal takes it a step further, and he explains that Adam was, in a certain regard, like, if you could imagine the human body, and every part of the human body, or possibly every molecule, every cell in the human body, would be one of the souls. You put them all together, you get the full anatomy. So in a similar way, you put together all the souls of history, and you'd have the mega soul of Adam. But the Arizal says, in the human anatomical metaphor of souls, there are basically two streams of souls. And people generally belong to one of the two streams, and they're represented by the two sons of Adam, Cain and Abel, Cain and Hevel. And those two sons are comparable to the shoulders. The function of shoulders, you don't think about it. I guess people take their anatomy for granted until, God forbid, they have any reason to have to worry about their health. So until a person has, God forbid, had an issue with their shoulders, we kind of take our shoulders for granted. You don't realize that the shoulders perform a function in the body that pretty much no other part of the body performs. And that is to give full rotation, right? People will tell you, those who've had shoulder injuries, they'll tell you about the rotator cuff. Because with the uniqueness of a shoulder, it gives you full rotation. Right? There's no other limb in the human body that can rotate in the way that a shoulder can. Now, one of the chaps of rotation is that means you have the ability to lower your hand down, take something off the ground, and lift it up using that rotative motion. You can lift it up even higher than your head. And for that reason, shoulders actually represent quite a lot of what being Jewish and spiritual growth is all about. Everybody thinks that spiritual growth is about reaching for the stars. That's true. But real spiritual growth is acknowledging that you don't start anywhere near the stars, that you start all the way down in the lowest reality, and yet that is not an impediment for you to raise yourself up to the highest heights. So the question is, how low can you go? I think there was once a little bit of a song like that, right? How low can you go? How low can a soul go? So that, says the Arizal, will depend on which stream you belong to. If you belong to the Abel, the Hevel stream, then that would imply that you have an even keel kind of a soul, which means that it's the kind of soul that doesn't get itself into too much trouble. It doesn't have those intense challenges that some people appear to have in their lives spiritually. And on the other hand, it means that you will always rise, but you won't have any of this rocket rise to incredible heights from nowhere. Whereas if somebody comes from the Cain stream of souls, then by rights, Cain, as we know, was somebody who at a very early stage of his life fell to the lowest depths. Think about it. Here's a person who killed his own brother when there was really nobody else on the planet. So he very quickly deteriorated. It's like this speeding bullet. And the souls that come from Cain, they have a predisposition to exactly that, to collapse very quickly and easily. And yet, on the other hand, if they pivot, because remember the shoulder is the rotation, right? So if they pivot, if they turn themselves around, those same souls, as rapidly as they could decline and disintegrate, as rapidly they could elevate themselves. So anybody who comes from that kind of a soul source will always see that there's something in their lives where they were like off the charts, so disconnected, and then they surprise us completely, because hopefully, that doesn't always happen, but hopefully they reach the highest heights. So Rabbi Akiva is a classic example of this, because Rabbi Akiva is a person who for the first 40 years of his life was disconnected from anything Jewish. He could barely read, and he had an attitude which said, if he came close to a Torah scholar, he would want to beat him. And then everything pivots, thanks to the input of his wife. And Rabbi Akiva goes from zero to hero, and he becomes the greatest Torah scholar, not only of that time, but of the entire Talmudic era, to the point that we say the entire Talmud is based on his teachings. That's why embedded in his name, Akiva, is the root Akev, the heel, because that's exactly his spiritual nature, to dafka come from the lowest of the low and to rocket up to the highest of the high. Now, we don't have as much of an historical background of Akavia ben Mahalalel. We don't know much about him, but we can assume, and the Arizal makes this point, that the fact that he's got Akev, this heel, in his name, that implies the same kind of principle, that this is somebody who has the capacity to take the lowest elements and to elevate them to the highest. Now, what we're about to learn in his teaching, Akavia ben Mahalalel's teaching, you're going to see that he does exactly that in this teaching. On the one hand, he addresses the lowest common denominator, and on the other hand, he has a message for somebody who's lifted themselves to the highest heights. So in order to be able to do that, you get the sense, that he's got a little bit of both realities, so to speak, both sides of the world, of the spiritual world. So let's have a look what it is that Akavia ben Mahalalel has to say. It's going to follow the typical thing that we've seen in a lot of these Mishnahs, where you have three teachings, right? Three primary teachings from a rabbi. Except in this particular case, you won't identify at first that he's teaching us three different teachings. In fact, when we look at it at first, it's going to look like it's one teaching, and there are three ways of saying it, which is going to raise the question for us, why do you need to say the same thing in three different ways? Just say it. Say what it is that you have to say. We know that the words of the Mishnah are usually incredibly precise. So if you've got a message, and the message needs to have three components, just list the three components. Why is it that he tells it to us as three separate stanzas? So here's the Mishnah. Akavia ben Mahalalel oimer, Akavia ben Mahalalel would say, Histakel bishloisha devorim ve'ein atobo lidei avera. Look at, focus on, consider three things, and you will never come to the hands of sin. Okay, so straight away, at this point, we should ask ourselves these questions. If you're about to tell me three things, why do you have to first tell me that you're going to tell me three things? Right? I mean, it's not a huge number. I think most of us, even on a Monday morning, even if you haven't had your coffee yet, I'm sure that we could work out that when you look at the list, there are three things. So why does he have to first tell us, look at three things? That's our first question. Our second question is, what is this expression that you should not come to the hands of an Avera? What does that mean? Why don't you just say, and you won't sin? Right? Ve'ein ata oiver, and you will not transgress. He doesn't say that. He says, ein ata ba, you won't come, lidei Avera, into the hands of a sin. Okay, so those are our first questions. Let's read on and see what it is that these three things you should think about are all about. What should you think about? Da me'ayin basa. Know from where you come. For those people who grew up with frum humor, so, it's quite a limited genre, by the way. It's been developed a little more in recent times. Frum humor. And I suppose the most niche version of frum humor is Kabbalistic humor, which we're not going to get into now. So anyhow, da me'ayin basa, from where have you come? So very often when people with a little bit of mischief in their minds would do school plays, they'd stick this in as a line, when somebody comes from the next shtetl, they'd say, me'ayin basa, where have you come from? And when you see what he says in the next stanza, you'll understand, well, that's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek, mischievous comment. So, da me'ayin basa, the first thing that you have to know is, where do you come from? Then you have to know, ule'on ata hoylech, and to where are you going? Okay? So, me'ayin, from where did you come? And to where are you going? V'lifnei mi ata osid litain din v'cheshbon. And in front of whom will you in the future have to give a reckoning of your life? So we already have three expressions here that are interesting. The word ayin, may ayin, from where. The word le'on, to where. And the word mi, who. As we're going to discover, those words play very important roles in understanding what's going on over here. Then he explains, Me'ayin basa, from where did you come? Mitipa serucha, from a, what they call in the English translation over here, a putrid drop. Ule'on ato hoilech, and where are you headed? Limkoim ofar rima v'solea, to a place of dirt, of rot, and of worms. Isn't that exciting? What we have to look forward to in life. And in front of whom will you in the future have to give a reckoning? In front of the King of all kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. Or blessed is He, if you want to give a more accurate translation. Now, if you read this, it looks like your classic, what we call a mussar shmuz, where you tell somebody a little bit of the fire and brimstone to get them to behave appropriately. So that's what he's saying. He says, who are you anyway? You come from nothing. You come from the most humble beginnings, as the Bartanura says. And where do you think you're going to go? What do you think your whole life is about? At the end of the day, you know where it goes. Story that they tell about a wealthy man who left his family 2 wills. So the first will that was kind of labeled will number 1, and you only open will number 2 after you've finished the contents of will number 1. So will number 1, they open it up after the funeral, and it says that he insists on being buried with his socks on. Okay, it's a big deal now. The funeral's already happened. And they go to the Chevra Kadisha and they say, our father's last will and testament. He says he wants to be buried with his socks on. This has nothing to do, even if we hadn't buried him already. Even if he was still in there, we're not going to put socks. It's against halakha. There's nothing to forget about it. He cannot put his socks. And they fight back and forth and they offer money and they try pressure and this and that. Nothing doing. Cannot bury somebody with their socks. So they realized that they failed the first will. They figured they'll try the second will. What does the second will have to say? So they open up the second will. The second will starts off, before he gets into the details of who gets what, starts off by saying, by now you should have learned that you cannot take it with you. Even a pair of socks you can't take with you after this world. So therefore, all of what you're going to now inherit, make sure that you use it well to help other people and give tzedakah, etc. As the famous line goes, in heaven they do not accept checks, they only accept receipts. So that's what he's saying, right? You come from nowhere. Where are you going? To nowhere. And remember that you're going to have to give evidence, give a reckoning in front of the King of Kings, which obviously sounds quite overwhelming and daunting. And that seems to be his message, right? So what's going on over here? What's Akavia ben Malalel looking to address? Well, the thing is looking to address, many of the commentaries point out, is the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, it's the part of ourselves that gets us into trouble, that convinces us to do things which are contrary to what we should do. So the Yetzer Hara is typically built on one core principle. Think about it, it's interesting, right? We always overcomplicate life, and we try to think about, that maybe there's this factor and the other factor, whatever, because when you overcomplicate life, you spin your wheels, you don't get anywhere. It's really useful to get down to the absolute basics. What is the tachlis? What is the Yetzer Hara's secret weapon? What makes the Yetzer Hara tick? What gets a person to do what's wrong? It is so incredibly simple when you think about it. What is it? Ego. Because if I didn't have an ego, if I was really dedicated with humility to whatever it is that Hashem wants, then I wouldn't do anything that I shouldn't do because I would accept it. I don't like these laws. Some of them are very challenging, but it's got nothing to do with me. This is what Hashem wants, and Hashem knows better, and Hashem is infinite, and Hashem is going to give me the most incredible opportunity to connect with Him through this kind of behavior. So this is what I got to do. Why do we do anything wrong? Because we take ourselves too seriously and we think, I appreciate what the Torah says and I appreciate what Judaism teaches, but I also have needs and I also have interests and I also have impulses and I also have weaknesses. So the core of undermining a Yetzer Hara is to get rid of that ego. Says Akavia ben Mahalalel, you have to realize I'm about to present you with 3 methods that you could use to neutralize your Yetzer Hara. But as soon as you hear them, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, okay, I resonate with one of the methods. That's going to be my method. Or maybe if you're really good, you'll say, I resonate with 2 of the methods, and those are going to be my methods. So therefore he starts off by saying, Istakel bishloisha devarim. You have to be aware of the fact that there are 3 methods. And they are all necessary. You have to take all 3 methods. Because if you don't take all 3 methods, your Yetzer Hara will still get the upper hand. So he's not telling us Istakel bishloisha devarim because we can't count. He's telling us you need all 3 of the 3 to be effective. Why? Start off from the beginning. So the Yetzer Hara comes along and says, you're a big deal, you're such an important person, and you also have an opinion, and you also have needs, and you also have weaknesses, and all these other things. And your therapist even told you how important it is to look after yourself. Says Akavia ben Mahalalel, realize, me'ayin basa. All these needs, all these things that we consider to be so important, ultimately are the product of the human physical bodily experience. And therefore, the more credibility we give to the body, the more likely it is that we will feel we have to satisfy these needs. So the first method is mi'ayin basa. Where do you come from already? Where did this body begin? From nothing. From nothing. So a person will say, yes, that's true. That is true. I'm willing to acknowledge that. I'm willing to acknowledge that I come from the most humble beginnings. It's the embarrassing tale of the human being that our origins are so basic and so simplistic, really, from our perspective. And there's an element maybe of shame even when you reflect on what it takes to conceive a human being. But now I'm here. And now that I am here, if I'm honest with myself, because it's really important to be honest with yourself, right? If I'm honest with myself, there are certain things that I believe that I need in order to be able to function, in order to be able to succeed, in order to do what it is that a human being has to do, that a Jewish person has to do. So it's all very well to say humble beginnings. That's all true. But at the end of the day, now that I'm here, we've got to talk. So he says, if that's the case, think about all of the investments that you're going to make in physical pleasure. Where's it going to land you in the future? Remember what Hillel said in the previous chapter? Marbe basar, marbe rima. The more a person invests in the fleshiness of self, the more they invest in their physical side, the more there's going to be in the grave for the worms. So once you create that perspective, you realize, listen, the truth is, I need and I want these things, but I have to have a bit of seichel. I have to be smart enough to recognize that you don't live your whole life just for the here and now. You've got to see that there's something to come in the future. What's to come in the future? Who are you going to have to face in the future? Melech Malchei Hamlochim HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God himself. So you need all 3 of these. You need a view of the future, and you need a view of the now. You need to be able to acknowledge that in the future you'll confront Hashem, and you have to acknowledge that now you're actually built of something which is temporary and from very humble beginnings. The Gemara tells a story that Shimon HaTzadik, you remember Shimon HaTzadik? He was in the first chapter. Shimon HaTzadik was a Kohen Gadol, and one of the rights of the Kohen Gadol was that if a person would be a Nazir who dedicated himself to Hashem and grew his hair long, if he would bring his offerings that he was required to bring, the Kohen Gadol would be able to take from those offerings. Shimon HaTzadik says, in my entire career, I never wanted to partake of the offerings of a Nazir. He had an issue that not every Nazir is necessarily so sincere, and perhaps there's a little bit of ego in whatever it is. Until such time, he says, that a fellow arrived, and he says this guy came and he had the most strikingly handsome face and the most horribly disheveled hair. So Shimon HaTzadik says, what's going on? Well, a guy like you has to look like a tramp. So the fellow says to Shimon HaTzadik, I'll tell you what happened to me. He says, one day, I went to a lake or a river, whatever it was, and I leaned over the water, either to wash my face or to drink, whatever it was. He says he leaned over the water, and he looked into the water, and he saw his reflection. Remember, there were no mirrors in those days. So, or I'm not saying there were no mirrors. Well, it was uncommon to have a mirror. So he looks in the water. The first time he's seen his reflection. He says, wow, you're one good-looking guy. That's dangerous. That could get you into a lot of trouble, he says. So somebody who's so good-looking like this could get you into a lot of trouble. So immediately he made a decision, right there and then, he's going to become a Nazir and allow his hair not just to grow long, but to be disheveled. So that would be a barrier against whatever temptation might be out there for such a good-looking guy. Shimon HaTzadik says when he saw that, for the first time he acknowledged that this is a Nazir whose offerings he would eat from, because this was a sincere Nazir. And that is effectively what Akavia ben Malalel is trying to tell us over here. When you look in the mirror, instead of seeing the perceived beauty, and I say perceived beauty because they say it's in the eye of the beholder at the end of the day, right? So every person looks at themselves and thinks to a greater or less extent. Either some people think they look magnificent and amazing, other people look in the mirror and they think they look absolutely terrible. So it says, look in the mirror, effectively, and see that whatever you see over here that you feel is so worthwhile to support and to feed, it's all transient and it's all eventually going to disappear. Okay? It's all eventually going to disappear. Now, when he gets to the point, so what's he done for us over here? Akavia ben Malalel. He's told us that the physical is transient and the physical has no real value, on the one hand, and on the other hand, he's telling us, you're going to stand in front of Hashem. It sounds so overwhelming. I mean, let's be honest, Hashem is the one who decided that we're going to have physical bodies. Hashem decided we're going to have these temptations, and then I'm going to have to give a reckoning in front of Hashem. It sounds so overwhelming. So a number of the commentaries point out that actually what he's trying to tell you is the exact opposite. You should not consider your ultimate confrontation with Hashem as scary. On the contrary, if you look at yourself through physical eyes, you have to shrug your shoulders and say, I have no value. What am I? A transient piece of flesh walking around on earth. That's not something of value. If you want to be really clinical about it, there are another 7 billion pieces of flesh walking around on the planet. Everybody's scavenging for the same money and food and experiences. What's special about me? So if I'm honest and objective, I don't actually have a value. We attribute value to ourselves. I don't have a value if all I am is this body, the body that comes from nowhere and goes to nowhere. Therefore, he says, that's not all you are. That body is going to decompose. It's going to happen. That body's going to be buried. That body's going to be disposed of. Unfortunately, there are people who believe that that's the end. But we don't. We say, after that, you will stand in front of Melech Malchei Amlochim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You will stand face to face with Hashem, because the ultimate experience is not that of the body. This is a reassurance. This is the moment where Akavia ben Malalel tells us, don't think it starts and ends just with the physical. Recognize that Hashem wants a reckoning from your life, which means two things. Number one, it means you live beyond the body. Number two, and perhaps even more importantly, it means Hashem takes a personal interest. It's not that you attribute a value to yourself because you think you're important. Hashem attributes a value to you. He thinks you're important. And not only does he think you're important, but he thinks that you have to give din v'cheshbon. That means the details of your life. You know, din v'cheshbon is a what do you call it, a balance sheet for those who are accountants or married to accountants, right? You know what a balance sheet is, right? You've got to have every line item has to be accurate. Every single detail counts. One of the most frustrating things for creative people is to work with an accountant who's always got the decimal place on the balance sheet. Like, just round it off. What's the big deal? No, you don't round it off. Every decimal makes a big difference. Din v'cheshbon means not just that you survive the physical life and live beyond. It means Hashem wants the details. What happened in your life? Who were you? What are the things you achieved? What were the challenges that you faced? Who were the people who were meaningful in your life, etc., etc.? This is the reassuring part of this Mishnah. At least, like I say, many of the commentaries bring that up.
Hi, sorry, can I just share something that I learned about Din B'Cheshbon? It was actually quite daunting.
Now we have to look at this Mishnah from a deeper perspective, a more mystical perspective. Why is it that he divides the Mishnah into three segments? Because actually, if you think about it, Mishnah is usually very concise. Remember that they didn't necessarily have copies of the Mishnah published, so it was designed to be easy to remember off by heart. It should have read like this. Akavia ben Malalel oimer. Akavia ben Malalel said, Istakel b'shloisha dvarim, ve'nata boli de'aver. Fine, we'll accept that has to be the introduction. Focus on three things, and you'll never sin. Now, it should have gone like this. Da me'ayim basa mitipa srucha. Know from where you come from a putrid drop. And where are you going? To a place of rot. Right? That's how it should have said it. Should have just read the whole thing right through. Why does he split it? That is histakel b'shloisha dvarim. Part 1, focus on three things. Part 2, he gives us like kind of in headlines. And only after that does he come back and revisit with all of this detail. Now we know that classically in Judaism we always describe that there are three types of Jews. One kind of Jew is called a tzaddik, one is called a beinoni, and one is called a rasha. There are two ways that you can explain all of those terms. The one way, and this is the way that people often like to explain it, is tzaddik is a really nice, good person, somebody who does more of the right thing than of the wrong thing. A beinoni is an average person who pretty much vacillates between good and bad and sometimes gets it right and sometimes gets it wrong. And a rasha is a rogue. A rasha is a villain, somebody who's really gone off the rails. That's often how we explain it. When you apply, however, the lens of Chassidus, we explain it completely differently. We explain that rasha, start from the bottom, rasha is any normal person who does things that are against what Hashem wants. Because there are a whole string of sources in the Torah, and particularly in the Gemara, that indicate that the minute a person does even a single thing which is contrary to what Hashem wants, at that moment they are classed as a rasha. A tzaddik, on the other extreme, is not only somebody who doesn't do wrong, doesn't do aveiros, but the definition of a tzaddik, as the pasuk says, is lo ye'une le'tzaddik kol oven. A tzaddik is protected, is immune from sin. So it's not that a tzaddik does not sin. Lo ye'une, it won't even happen to a tzaddik that he should sin. Some fascinating stories that we have through the course of our history of great tzaddikim who were put into positions that ordinary people would have sinned in, and they had like the sixth sense that something was wrong, that the food wasn't kosher or whatever it is. They're protected from being able to do an avera. The beinoni is the ultimate state of the ordinary person. That's why it's called beinoni, average. The beinoni is the ultimate state of the average person, which means a state where the person feels the temptations that you and I feel, but has learned an incredible discipline, and because of that discipline, never succumbs to those temptations. That's a beinoni. So we would say, halavai a beinoni. We wish to become a beinoni. Okay? So again, a rasha does not have to be a villain. A rasha is an ordinary person who still, even if it's just on occasion, succumbs to the Yetzer Hara. Akave ben Malalel, who's got the shoulder kind of element to him, he can pivot from the lowest of the low to the highest of the high, can teach a lesson to the tzaddik, and equally can teach a lesson to the rasha. You know, not many people can relate to both realities. And this is Akavia ben Malalel's incredible ability. He can relate to all the realities, tzaddik, rasha, and everything in between. And that's why he has three different teachings here. Because depending on who you're talking to, you have to share a different message to achieve the same result. First, he talks to the tzaddik. To the tzaddik, he says, Histakel b'shloisha devarim. Tzaddik, you do not have to grapple with the issues of what happens if my Yetzer Hara gets the better of me, and how should I overcome temptation. You don't have any of those issues. So you're a tzaddik. Your primary way of connecting to Hashem is through doing positive. So we know that there are two parts of Judaism. There's sur meira, to avoid the negative, va'asei tov, to be proactive in doing the positive. You tzaddik, your primary focus is asei tov. It's just that when you engage with asei tov, histakel b'shloisha devarim. You have to understand that the nature of Judaism is three-dimensional. Because a tzaddik is likely to see only two dimensions, Hashem and himself. My job, to connect to Hashem. That's it. Says Akavia ben Malalel, you have to realize, tzaddik, histakel b'shloisha devarim. If it was just between you and God, your neshama would still be in heaven. The fact that Hashem sent your neshama down into this world means there's a third element that you have to impact as well, and you have to elevate. What is that? That's the world around you. So not only asei tov, not only should you do good in your personal life, asei tov, you have to do good in a way that impacts everything that is in your sphere of influence, including your physical environment, needless to say other people, and perhaps even things that teeter on the edge of impurity. And that's why it says, if you keep that in mind, then einata ba lidei avera. It's out of the question that he could sin. He's a tzaddik. It's out of the question. He's not going to sin. What does the tzaddik have to avoid? Lidei avera. You know, a yad in English is a hand or a handle. So if you've got a dish, a pot, let's say, and the handle of the pot is called the yad. It's called the handle, right? It's called the yad, the hand of the pot in Hebrew. Lidei avera, he's not going to sin. But if the tzaddik isn't focused as he should be, he could kind of by extension allow others to sin. If the tzaddik isn't having his influence over his environment, if he's just focused on himself, what we call a tzaddik in pelts, a tzaddik who's wearing a nice warm coat and never thought of the idea of turning on heat for everybody else. So if he's just focused on himself, he could get lidei avera, to the kind of thing that could lead to others sinning. That's the message to the tzaddik. Tzaddik, you've got to focus and remember that the nature of how Hashem has established the world is that it requires and includes a physical side, a third dimension. Without that third dimension, you're stuck. You're not going to be able to do what Hashem wants. After that, he speaks... Yes?
What use is it?
Then we have to address the Beinoni. Now, the nature of the Beinoni is that a Beinoni also primarily focuses on asei tov, on doing what is positive, because the Beinoni doesn't actually sin, but the Beinoni has to constantly be reminded of the kind of inspiration. The Beinoni has to constantly feed his soul so that he doesn't succumb. Okay, because the Beinoni feels the temptation, it just has the strong discipline in place in order to keep the temptation in check. In order to keep the temptation in check, the Beinoni has to constantly inspire himself primarily through the process of prayer. That's the meditation of davening is the primary way in which he inspires himself. And obviously by constantly learning. So to him, Akavia ben Malalel says there are three things you have to think about. May ayin basa. Ayin is an expression that describes what preceded creation. We talk about, the Ramban tells us that creation is yesh may ayin. It is existence that comes from nothing. May ayin basa, we're telling the Beinoni, you have to recognize that your neshama comes from ayin, from that level of reality that is beyond comprehension. If something is beyond our comprehension, we say it doesn't exist. We claim it is nothing. So may ayin basa, not just that your body comes from nothing invaluable and important. It's a more profound message. Your soul comes from an incredibly deep dimension of godliness that is ayin that we can never begin to grasp. Not only that, but after this life, and even after Gan Eden, when you reach the stage of Tchias HaMeis in the resurrection, le'on ata hoylech. That word on is different to the word ayin because it's got one less letter. Ayin is aleph, yud, nun, and on is just the aleph and the nun without the yud. And the mystics tell us that it therefore represents a level that is even higher than the level of ayin. Do we know what it is? We have no idea. But the message to the Beinoni is, not only does your neshama originate at an incredibly lofty level, but because you'll do what you need to do in this world, you'll be able to catapult your neshama to an even deeper dimension of godliness after this world. What level of godliness is that? Lifnei me. Me is also a question. I don't know who I'm talking about. And you'll find there are many places in the Torah that we refer to Hashem with the word me. Right? Me, as if to say we don't know who we're talking about. And that's exactly the message to the Beinoni, that through your service in this world, which is primarily to do what is right, because you pretty much have the discipline in place not to do what is wrong, so your primary focus is to do mitzvahs, that will get you to a place of me, so to speak, face to face to the unknown dimension of God. The Beinoni will be tremendously inspired by this kind of concept, whereas the Rasha needs a little bit of scare tactics, because the Rasha is still grappling with the Yetzer Hara, and so all the commentaries we noted right at the beginning about humility and about not focusing on the flesh, that's all towards the Rasha. The Rasha needs that kind of language to be able to overcome the temptation of his Yetzer Hara. And so Akavia ben Mahalalel has therefore offered 3 different teachings to 3 different kinds of Jewish people, and in that has given us an incredible insight into where all those 3 different types of people live in their spirituality. Well, hopefully we need the message of the Beinoni, but in the meantime we may well need the message of the Rasha, at least until we, graduate to Beinoni status.